Okay, so we're going to have a little delve into my cluttered mind in relation to spring fishing. It's March at the moment, and as you can see, it's still pretty chilly. It's about 4 degrees this morning when I got here. You know, the lake is starting to wake up. Nature is starting to wake up now. We're starting to see a lot of signs week on week. I started my campaign back at my syndicate lake in around about the 3rd week of February, and it's fascinating to see the changes evolve as the season progresses. Not only have we had the massive extension in daylight hours, or minutes, maybe hours, but it's very, very noticeable. But each week there's more going on. Last week I had the first damsel nymph crawling out of the lake. It was sat on the edge of my sleeping bag, and this week I've seen the first 2 bats, and there's buds on the trees, and the long-tailed tits are going crazy. Even the evening chorus, just as dusk is going, is absolutely incredible, even compared to last week. And that's all in recognition of one thing. It's not temperature, because as you can see, it's still pretty chilly. It's in recognition and reaction to daylight hours. And that is the catalyst for all things in nature to start to come alive, whether it's daffodils or birds or the geese that have been coming in to land on the lake that are looking for partners. It's all caused by the change in daylight hours, and we're rapidly approaching the equinox now, where the daylight hours are virtually the same as those that we get at night. It's a very, very exciting time to be out. You know, you're filled with a sense of possibility and awe and wonder, and what will the season have in store for me? Will it be like last year? We all have different plans, different aims, different objectives, new tickets, new missions. It's an incredibly exciting time to be out as a carp angler, and obviously with the restrictions that we've had in place, which have meant no night fishing, that's all going to change soon, so people will be able to get back into it full on. And you know, I'm very against a lot of the restrictions, because I think that there's very little data and science to back them up. But the plus side of that is that the fish have had a really nice break. They've had a nice extended winter break and been left alone largely, so it's all to play for. I think there's a couple of key things to discuss at the outset before we get into the mindset and the approach. Let's just touch on being ready for the spring. So being prepared for the season ahead is very important. A lot of people haven't fished through the winter, and sometimes the kit might have been just left in the shed until now, and I think it's very, very important to take stock of things. You know, if you're not going to go fishing maybe until April, the clock is ticking, take advantage of that time. You know, spend an evening after work sorting through everything, and it's a time that I like to use to slim things down again. You know, we accumulate a lot of stuff, and usually tubs of hookbaits and stuff like that we carry and very rarely use. And that's my general rule of thumb. If I find something that is in my bag and I haven't used it for a year or barely used it, then I take it out. I put it in the shed, or I put it in the back of the van, and I just stick to the ones that I've been using. Usually they're the ones that are almost empty, you know. So we do accumulate a lot of stuff that we don't need, and they get taken out. Things like bivvy lights, like I might have used through the winter on those dark nights. It's all extra weight and generally a bit of a sort out. And be ruthless, and you'll be amazed the sensation of keenness and vigour that you get from slimming all your gear down. Suddenly the barrow doesn't seem half as heavy as it used to be, and you're off. It's a really important part of getting ready for the spring, but there's a lot of other elements, none more so important than line. Check your line. You don't have to replace your line every season necessarily. You don't have to replace it in the spring. It is nice to have new line on for the season ahead, don't get me wrong, but you might have put it on in the autumn. There might be nothing wrong with it. There's no reason to change it if there's nothing wrong with it. As I've said before, the time to change your line is when it gets so low on the spool that it's affecting your casting performance, because it's so low but below the lip. There should never at any time be any bad quality line on your reel. Whatever is on there should always be perfect. And the time to change it, big swan come in for a fight with the other swans, it's that time of year now, everything's battling for territory. And soon the carp anglers will be as well. So the time to change it is if it's too low on the spool. If there's nothing wrong with the line, don't change it, but do check it. And a general other sort through, you know, we carry, most people I go out on tutorials with and so on, they have like massive bags of leads that probably weigh, some of them I've seen must weigh 4 or 5 kilos of leads and bits and pieces, you know. Get an ice cream tub, take all your leads out, put them in the back of the car or in the van, keep them in there as spares, and keep 4 or 5 leads that you use in your bag. Things like that, for me, they make a real difference, because having less clutter and less weight and less mess just helps me get focused on the task ahead. And it's a great way of reinvigorating your enthusiasm, you know, after the winter, if you haven't fished, or if you have fished and it's been a hard, wet, cold, muddy old winter, it's nice to plan ahead and get that enthusiasm back. Make sure you've got spare batteries for your buzzers, you know. Sometimes that's important any time of year, but if your alarms have just been in the shed in a damp environment, switched off for ages, you don't want them failing the first time you go out. Little bits of maintenance and preparation. A key thing that I always make sure that I have ready for this time of year is, in fact, my rule is from March until November, I always have my floater rod in the van. A bucket of floaters, some hook baits, some little bubble controllers, and a rod that's set up ready to go, so that if there is a surface opportunity, I'm not bastardizing one of my carp rods by bringing it in, cutting off the leg clip and trying to make good do with that as a floater rod. You know, you can't do that with thick 15-pound line and a 3 1/4 pound test curve. You just get a rod that's dedicated to it. You know, it's every year that will catch you an extra fish or two. I mean, last year I only caught 1 fish off the top. It was over 48 pounds. So if I hadn't have had that kit ready in the van, that capture could have passed me by. So don't wait until the sun comes out and it's warm and sunny to get your floater gear ready and with you. Now is the time, so that when that sun does peek through, you're ready to have a go at them, because the very best time to catch a big carp or any carp off the surface is early on, when they haven't been hammered on floaters and they pop up for those first few warm days, and they're not far away, you know. I mean, we're in the middle of March now, so you know, if we had a sustained period of 2 or 3 weeks of warm sunny weather, in a month's time they could be spawning. It can change very, very quickly. So be ready for the floater fishing if you're that way inclined. If you're not that way inclined, then fair enough, but you're missing out on an opportunity. So that general preparedness is a key part. Little things like, if you've got a big hole in your landing net, I know it sounds silly, but the last thing you want is to catch a big carp and have its fin go through that hole and risk damaging it. So you can stitch up your nets. All sorts of things you can do. Get your gear out, lay it out on the lawn on a sunny afternoon and have a good sort through. Preparing that gets you prepared up here and gets you focused. Hopefully you've all got, well, you'll either have missions to continue at lakes that you've been fishing, and you'll have ideas and plans to improve on what you did or what you didn't get last year, or maybe you've got new dreams, new hopes, new tickets, new syndicates. So it's a time of amazing potential and excitement. Moving on to the mindset of spring fishing, one point that I need to cover is pointing out what I would probably perceive as the biggest error going into this phase. I get a lot of messages on social media asking now, while it's still cold, water's probably, I used to have a thermometer, but a pike bit it off, but so I guess it these days, but generally I'll take a mean average of the day and the night time temperatures added together, and then cut in half as a mean average over a period of a couple of weeks or so will give you a guideline. And at this time of year, right now, we're probably edging up towards 7.5, 8 degrees. It's a long way off double figures, and that's the key point. When that water just tips into double figures, the carp in particular, will get very, very active. So if you've got a mean average of 10 or 12 degrees over a couple of weeks, then the water temperature should be pushing up towards that. So again, you're looking for nights getting towards double figures, and days of maybe 12s, add them together, 22, cut in half, 11, you've got that for a couple of weeks, your water temperature should start creeping up towards that. But it does take a while. And it reminds me actually, a few weeks, well, probably about a month ago, when we had that really nice warm sunny weather in February, I was doing something in the garage. I stupidly unplugged the freezer and I didn't realise it for a week. And during that week it went really warm and the outside of the garage was baked in sunshine. We had a lot of days in mid-double figures and frost-free nights, quite warm nights. And it was about a week when I noticed that I'd left this freezer unplugged. I was like, oh, gone out there, lifted the lid, and the stuff on top, the bait on top, had thawed. It's not a problem. You haven't got to throw it away if this ever happens to you. I rooted around and didn't have to go down very hard, and it was still frozen solid after a week. And that's, I think, is in a lot of ways is similar to what's going on with your lake. It takes an enormous amount of time for warm air to permeate through and actually warm those layers of water, just like a fridge down there at the bottom of the lake. You know, it's the end of the winter. We've not had any sustained weather. So what I'm getting at is that with the first couple of warm days, people tend to go gung-ho. It's spring, let's get out there, let's give it to them. And if there's one thing that I've learned over my lifetime doing it, but certainly in the last 10 years, one of the biggest changes I've made is not to do that. And we'll look at bait specifically and tactics and so on in a little while, but when it comes to bait application, the general mindset from the majority of carp anglers seems to be, as soon as the sun comes out, start giving them bait. And I think that's the worst thing you can do. Now, if you do happen to be on a lake that is full of doubles and 20s and they're hungry fish, you might get away with it, but I can promise you, in my experience from fishing a wide range of waters, especially when it comes to big and old carp, it's the worst thing you can do. So from now, middle of March, I will carry on fishing as I have pretty much through the winter. In fact, through the winter period, I will tend to put in a bit more bait, perhaps if the situation's right, than I would in the spring. So that's worth thinking about, you know. If I know where they are in the winter, then crumb and maggots and that applied where they are is a very good tactic. But certainly as you come into March, April, leading up to when things are really getting active, the more you put in, generally speaking, and remember all of these are generalizations just based on my carp fishing experience, the more you put in, the less chance you're going to have of getting a bite, particularly if it's a big and old fish. And the reason for that is that carp have one objective at this time of year, only one, and it's not to eat. All they want to do is get their body up to operating temperature, as I call it, so that they can then spawn. That's their modus operandi. That is what they're programmed to do. To that end, they'll be seeking out the thermoclines, mid layers and so on. They'll be seeking out sun traps on the back of the wind often, not always, but often, in an effort to get their body temperature up. As their body temperature rises, then they'll be able to take on a bit more food, but more importantly, and as I said, the primary objective is to get ready for spawning. If you're a big, old, weighty, fat carp, all you want to do is get rid of that spawn. You don't want to eat a bucket of spod mix. And if I could go back to my younger self and give one bit of advice, that would be very high on the list. Don't go gung-ho in the spring and think, sun's out, let's get the spod out and give them a bucket full, because it's very, very counterproductive. Again, I'm specifying that if you're chasing big, old fish, then you will catch more by getting a fishing for a bite, which we'll cover in more detail later on. So I just wanted to address that because it's the main question I get. When can I start piling in bait? And I'm getting these questions this week, last week, the week before. People are ready to go and they think that as soon as they do go, as soon as they're out of those starting blocks, out the traps, there's only one way forward, and that is to put out a bucket of bait. And yeah, don't do it. Fish for a bite. Continue with a softly approach for at least another month, maybe more, certainly into May. fishing for a bite is something that I found is much more productive in the spring when you're targeting big fish. Let's continue with the subject of bait and meander through the course of my thought process. It's not in any particular order. I made a few notes that I want to talk about, but while we're on the subject of bait, another key, what I'm trying to do is address questions that I get a lot on my social media, because obviously they're the things that are forefront of viewers' minds. And another one that I get right now at this time of year is about fish meals, and when is it time to make that transition. To put it in a nutshell, you can start using krill, for example, whenever you want. The fact that, the idea that fish will find fish meals repugnant because the water's cold is a complete urban myth. It's a complete falsification of everything. I've caught quite a lot of fish on krill in the cold. In fact, we were out filming in February and I had a few fish on krill. The thing is, and this is the only part of it that is true, is that fish meals are, especially a rich, very high quality fish meal like the krill, is harder to digest for the carp while the water's really cold. They will still eat it and they still want to eat it. You know, carp love fishy, strong, potent flavours just as much in January as they do in July. So don't have this perception that, oh, it's cold, their taste buds have changed and now they want something sweet and creamy, and oh, now it's warmed up, now they want something savoury and fishy, because it doesn't work like that. You know, carp, some of the most effective carp flavours and attractors of all time, squid and octopus, for example, deadly in bitter cold weather. You know, it's just that the onward moving bait trends have kind of programmed people's minds into thinking that it needs to be sweet, nutty, creamy, fruity, and whilst they work, so do fish meals. So it's the middle of March. If you're going to use, if you want to start using krill now, you can start now. If I have been using it through the winter, then I just carry on, but I keep the quantities low. If I've been using a different bait through the winter and I'm going to start using krill, then I would start using it now. You know, back end of March is absolutely fine. As I said, the only thing that you need to bear in mind is the quantity that you're using, because it's harder to digest. So that ties in perfectly with my whole spring approach, which is just fishing for a bite anyway, you know. So the whole application and quantity of bait is obviously key to that whole process, fishing for a bite. Now, I thought I saw a fish out there then. If you adopt that mindset for your entire season, you won't go far wrong. And as I've said before, a lot of people have this perception that the more bait they apply, the more bait they use in the swim, the more fish they're going to catch. And in certain rarefied examples or occasions, that may be true. But for the majority of carp fishing situations, that will be counterproductive. And I'm talking across the whole gamut of different fishing situations. You know, it's always better to try and catch a carp and then try and catch your next carp than think, right, I'm going to go and smash it this session, let's put out loads of bait, because that is not the most productive use of your time or your bait, I would suggest. Certainly in recent years, I've seen a downward trend on that, and my own fishing, the results have come to fishing for a bite, not using much bait, but applying it as I go. So if I catch a fish off a spot over 2 or 3 spoms, let's say, for example, then I might put out 5 or 6 and put it back there and see if I can build the area. But I don't go in heavy to begin with. It was interesting, actually. I was just writing my diary for Carpology last week, and I was reading my diary, my handwritten diary, so that I got everything down that was factually correct. And it was very notable. It was a July session, and I started off by putting out 2/3 of a bucket, and it was notable. I flicked through my diary, and it was the only time that I did that year, and it was because the fish had just spawned, the weather was right, the moon was right, the fish were in the area, and I just thought, this is a time when I can put in a bit of bait, and it did pay off for me. But generally speaking, throughout entirely in its entirety, the rest of the season was fishing for a bite and then taking it from there. So particularly in the spring, as you go from now mid-March till perhaps the end of May, again it's even more pertinent and more important to fish for a bite as you go. And to that end, most of or all of my fishing will be based around zigs, singles, and very bags possibly, and very light baiting with boilies. By light baiting, again, it doesn't differentiate too much from what I'm doing in the summer. 10 baits around a hook bait, 5 baits around a hook bait is absolutely ample to get you a bite. You don't need loads, particularly in this phase. Find the fish and get near them. Now, I'm not a particularly well-versed angler on zigs. Caught fish on them over the years up to 37 pound, I think my biggest on a zig, but I don't do loads of zig fishing, and I know that it's something that I need in my armoury a bit more. I've used them a lot over the last few weeks, actually not had a bite on them, but then again, no one's where I'm fishing, nothing's been caught since before Christmas, so I'm not ruling them out. And although I'm not a great zig angler by any stretch, I'm quite fortunate that I can tap into the minds of a few guys who I perceive to be some of the best zig anglers in the country, you know. Lucky to know these guys, so always poaching them for information, asking them about, because I love learning stuff. And there is no doubt that black foam zigs play a huge part in the capture of carp between now and probably the end of April, so bear that in mind. A good tip, I mean, one of the things that stops people using zigs is having to tie zigs and make zigs, and that whole how many rods should you commit to it, and so on and so forth. But get yourself a little zig storage thing. Fox make a nice one. Tie up a load of zigs and tie them over length. By that I mean is if your water is 10 foot deep throughout, or its deepest part is 10 foot, then tie them all at 10.5 foot. Because then if you need a 6 footer, you can just bite it down and use it. You haven't got to tie along. So just tie them all long and cut them down to. But if you've got half a dozen zigs tied in a storage bin, ready to go, you'll be much more inclined to put a zig out when it looks right. Generally speaking, as we go forward into the spring, then a good area to target the fish is the top third of the water column, so 2/3 up. So if it's 10 foot deep, then 7 foot zigs will be a good start point, 7 or 8 foot. Black foam seems to be the best. Again, that's something that I've asked a lot of very proficient zig anglers over the years repeatedly. Unflavoured black foam. It's bizarre, but it seems to be the one. And then I just fish that with a leg clip and a tail rubber, an anti-tangle sleeve, no tubing. A lot of people, again, that's another question I get about leaders and tubing with zig rigs. You don't have anything. It's your bare line straight through to a tail rubber and a leg clip, and then an anti-tangle sleeve on the front end. The most imperative thing with zigs, stop them before they hit the water, and that'll prevent the tangle. Fish them on a tight line, high sensitivity with a big bobbin. I'm hoping that zigs are going to produce a bonus extra fish or two for me this spring, and I'm going to be giving them a lot more of a go. You've got to take notice of what's going on around you, and when people like my mate Dave Lane tell me that if he could go back and have one word with his younger self, it would be to use zigs in the winter and the spring, then you've got to take note. You know, a lot of carp will be caught across the country in the next 6 weeks or so on zigs, so keep your mind open and your options open and be prepared in that respect. Bags, something like the depth charge system that I've shown on other videos, is ideal for fishing for a bite, casting it where you've seen fish and leaving it. As I said, it's perfect for eliciting that one response that you want, rather than putting in loads, putting out the marker float, piling in the bait and just fishing in that predictable method. So zigs, bags, light baiting with boilies, and of course singles. Now when it comes to single hook baits, obviously the default setting for 99% of carp anglers is a single bright one, and that is complete anathema to me, and I'm probably a bit too stubborn for my own good sometimes, and I just don't like using them because of the oversaturation and because of visual occasions and experiences I've had in the past where I've been able to determine without any question that they're more likely to pick up a brown one than they are a bright one. having said that, so many anglers can't be wrong, especially when it comes to people like with the calibre of Dave Lane, Miles Gibson. You know, they'll always say in the spring, get a bright one under their nose, and that's all you'll need to do. Whilst I don't see it quite as simple as that, these guys can't all be wrong, and it's just not something that's hugely in my locker. I fish singles, absolutely, I fish singles a lot, but it will usually be either a match the hatch, or it'll be a pale washed out sort of boilie, you know, a mid-brown sort of colour. The whole idea of super bright beacon neon hookbait scares me to death, and you're probably more likely to find Tom Maker creeping around Redmire with a centre pin and a Mark IV Avon than you would find me casting out a bright yellow one. But they do work, so don't discount them based on me banging on about match the hatch all the time. Maybe ditch the Ronnie, you know, that is totally overused, and you know, fish them up a bit high, long high chods, you know, no one uses those anymore. But yes, there does, you know, all these guys can't be wrong, you know, Joe Morgan, you know, so many people that are good friends of mine that say, Penny, you really got to get a bright one on. So yeah, I'll give it a go at some point. So yeah, so we've looked at bags, singles, zigs, light baiting with boilies. Again, if you're going to fish a food bait or something, you know, that is a match the hatch or something, you only need 5 freebies round it, half a dozen catapulted round it to get a bite, and that will stand you in good stead throughout the angling year, but particularly between now and maybe the end of May, up until spawning time, really. So bear that in mind. Less is more. Fish for a bite, and spend all your efforts in trying to get on them. Just had a little bit of a reshuffle. Rain stopped play temporarily. Well, it would have stopped it permanently the way it's looking, so we've just moved around, stuck up a brolly so we can get this finished. So we were talking about bait, and just to round off, you know, there will be some of you out there who are fishing lakes that are more prolific, maybe full of singles, doubles, 20s, big stocks of fish that are likely to maybe be hungry in the spring because of the nature of their environment, i.e. big numbers of fish in a smallish body of water without much natural food perhaps, and those sort of scenarios will have a stock of fish which is more likely to be dependent, reliant, and looking for bait. If you are fishing that sort of lake, less is more. Again, generally I always suggest erring on the side of get a bite and work from there, but on those sort of lakes, if you are fishing one, it might pay to introduce a bit with the spawn, and a really good mix. Really, I mean, if I was putting in a spod mix or a spawn mix at this time of year, it wouldn't really differentiate from or differ in any way from what I'd use in the winter. So it'd be boilie crumb, maybe a ground bait mixed into it, boilie crumb, small pellets, maggots and corn. You know, that is a fantastic combination. A lot of people ask me about Baileys. People seem to think that Baileys is just for the winter, just for the cold weather. There aren't any rules. To that end, I would say, you know, you haven't got to think within rigid constraints. There are no rules. By that I mean, and again, it harks back to some of the questions that I get asked. Could you put a banana pop-up in a squid flavour glug? Absolutely. There are no rules. You haven't got to think, oh, it's a banana pop-up, I've got to put something creamy and sweet on it. Carp have all sorts of weird, strange taste predilections, and one of the greatest pop-up or flavour combinations I've ever used is Scopex and squid and octopus. And when those two flavours are put together, you get a fishy, extremely fishy, horrible sort of, so I think it's lovely, but you know what I mean, that sort of smell mixed with the smooth, eminent creaminess of Scopex. You wouldn't think they go together, but one of the best combinations I've ever used. So there are no rules. You can use Baileys all the way through the summer if you want to, and I have done. I know a lot of people use it in France and all over. You know, Baileys, if something is really good and inherently attractive to the fish, it doesn't, I can't think of an example of something that just stops for one season and doesn't start working again until the next season comes round again. There may be one, but I can't think of any. So yeah, a good bait combination would be something like that: crumb, ground bait, small pellets, maggots, corn, chopped boilies. Again, the emphasis being on small food items and lots of attraction from liquids and what you're going to get dispersing into the water column from blending up your boilies and stuff like that. So that with either a little pop-up over the top or a little wafter. I think some people call them wafters, but whatever, you know what I mean. Fished over the top will be very successful. And I wouldn't generally be getting into particles until later on in the summer when they've had a spawn, and then I'll be looking at salt, hemp, tigers and all that sort of thing. But for now, yeah, a good spring mix will be very, very similar or identical to the mix that you might use for your winter fishing. That's something that I've detailed at length in a previous video, so check that out if you haven't seen it. Right, so I've got a few notes. Let me just make sure I haven't missed anything which is swirling around in my bonds. The Equinox. So we're on the Equinox just about now. I think the clocks go next week or the week after. That means we've got an equal amount of daylight to nights, and obviously that will continue to shift up until the 21st of June with increasing daylight, and then it starts dropping away again. Now, throughout the winter, well, I would say the transition begins in the autumn when activity on almost every water I've ever fished starts to become very nocturnal. And that usually begins October time and will usually manifest itself through the entirety of the winter. In fact, every water I think I've fished in the winter has had a bias towards nocturnal activity in terms of fish showing and in terms of the bites themselves. That will definitely start to change now. And again, as a rough rule of thumb, based on all the waters I've fished over the years, the springtime, the phase that we're just coming into now, you will start to see a shift towards daytime activity. So that might benefit you, it might hinder you. You know, if you're someone who's just doing work overnighters, it might go against you a little bit, but if you're someone who can only do day sessions, it could very much go in your favour. And of course, having that knowledge means that you can maximise your fishing time. Think about when you're going to be winding in to bait up and when you want your rigs in situ for. Daytime activity is it's going to be about when you're going to get your bites in that period of daytime, but also about when you see the fish. And of course that is the cornerstone of everything: where you see the fish, what they're doing, and where you position yourself in reaction to that. So we come to the final part of the equation, which is a bit reversed in terms of chronology. In terms of importance, it should come first, but we're going to cover it last, and that is location during the spring phase. Again, I always reiterate this: location is a constantly moving, amorphous subject because carp are wild creatures. Every lake is different, and the fish within each lake are different, and the pointers that I'll put out there are just guidelines based on my experience and the experiences of my peers, and they should be taken as that. There are no rigid rules, because carp are wild animals and they will go where they want any given time. They don't follow a rule book, and they will very, very often be where you least expect them to be. And very often where they will be where they want to be and not where you want them to be. So always bear that in mind. It's good to have fucking hell. Okay, so where were we? I lost my train of thought because it turned out to be a pike, but a good pike showed out there and totally distracted me. And then I jumped up, and luckily I wasn't holding a cup of tea, and it come up again, so it definitely was a pike, and they're quite active this time of year. And then it stopped raining, blue sky, and we're back to a beautiful, lovely day. So I was saying that the carp will always be where they want to be and not where you want them to be. Always bear that in mind. It's okay to have predetermined ideas of where you might want to look first, but be very, very wary of following those ideas, guidelines, or suppositions that you might have to the detriment of actually seeing a fish. So it's all very well going, oh, this is a nice wind, or following whatever signs that you might like the look of, new lilies coming up, or it could be anything. But there is nothing more rock solid concrete than seeing a fish, and that is to be placed more highly than any other ideas that you might have about where the carp might be. On very, very certain occasions, maybe if you've had to do the school run, let's say, for example, because we all have to juggle real life, which has meant that you then can't get to the lake at first light and you're on the back foot. That and a variety of other situations may mean that you can't see the lake at first light and you don't know where they are. And then, of course, until the next sign avails itself, you have nothing other to go on than fishing on instinct. I would still strongly suggest spending as much time as possible looking. When I turned up at the lake here, I spent a long time looking up trees, round bays, under snags and so on, and I didn't see anything, so I set up where I thought looked good. But that was after a good 3 or 4 hours of looking, and I know that over the next, maybe from the next session next week or maybe the week after, I will start to find them, and I'll continue to hopefully find them until November, because we're coming into the phase now where if you can't find a carp on virtually every lake most days, then you're probably not looking hard enough. Obviously there's exceptions to the rule. If you've got a 300 acre lake with 5 carp in, that might be stretching it a bit, but certainly on most carp lakes you're coming into the time now where if you haven't seen a carp, then you're probably not looking hard enough. So let's assume that we haven't seen the ultimate sign, which is what I call carp flesh, because there is no confusion about what that is or what it means. That shows you that there is a carp there. Again, we've done a whole video on Watercraft, which is part of this series, so there's loads and loads of pointers in that, so it probably would be worth, if you want to up your Watercraft, having a look at that. But pertaining specifically to spring fishing at the moment, as we're discussing, let's assume that you haven't seen carp flesh and you're not quite sure where they might be. What sort of areas should we be considering to maybe look in first? And then if we look there first and then we check other areas and we still haven't seen anything, then which areas should we want to be setting our stall out in? Incidentally, if I ever do end up doing that, and sometimes you have to, I would only set out my stall mentally in terms of a temporary, setting my roots down temporarily, I should say. If I haven't found the fish and I'm not sure I'm on them, then I wouldn't be setting up with anything more in mind than I'm sitting here until the first fish shows, and then I'm going to have to move and get on it. Always have that mindset of flexibility, that unless you're on them, you ain't going to catch them. That's what it comes down to. It couldn't be any more black and white than that. Areas that I would start investigating in the spring, particularly on gorgeous days as this has now turned out to be. It's gone up about 5 degrees in half an hour. The rain has all blown away. We've got a lovely strong sun. I mean, you can see just looking around yourselves at this time of year, the apex of the sun's transition is so much higher now than it was even 2 or 3 weeks ago. I would be very, very keen to Polaroids, just while I think of it. Really haven't, and Polaroids are probably my #1 piece of fishing tackle. Haven't had too much need for them or use for them through the winter months, and that's quite often the case. But now travelling without Polaroids is a fool's game. They are absolutely essential. And looking into sun traps with Polaroids from now on really, but particularly in the spring, as I said earlier, the carp's #1 motivation is to get its body temperature up in preparation for spawning. It's all about its body temperature, and they will without question seek out areas of warmth and sunlight where the two go together, in preference of anything else, generally speaking, most of the time. So south facing banks, areas like this bank actually that get the sun for the majority of the day are always high on my list to look. Reed beds and snags. If you've got areas of reed beds that have got 3 foot or more of water in along the front edge of them, then very, very often they will hold carp in the spring. Carp love reeds in the winter and the spring very, very much, and when they're in them, it's quite easy to tell. You'll see the twitching reed stems. But if you have got extensive areas of reeds on your lake, always worth looking at in the spring. They are absolute bankers really for carp location in the spring. As I said, particularly if you've got a bit of depth in them. As little as 2 foot, 2.5 foot can be enough, but if you've got 3s, 4s or 5s along those front edges, then, and they're south facing, then I would be very, very keen on investigating those early. If you can safely get up trees, then do so. If not, then use a ladder. I carry a telescopic ladder in the van so that I can get elevation. Elevation is the name of the game for finding carp at all times of the year. And it all begins now. You know, the ladder will be coming out more, the Polaroids will be used all the time. And April, well, March we're in now, but going into April is really the time when you'll get the best water quality of the year. You'll get great visibility. We're probably a couple of months, let's hope, away from any possible algal blooms. You've got good visibility, lots of oxygen in the water, and it's a great time for watching fish coming into the margins for the first time of the year, which is something they will start to be doing now. As they come into those margins, they are they can be very, very catchable on small traps with very, very limited quantities of bait. Sweet corn is a fantastic way of trapping a fish like that. And again, you do not need very much. 6 or 7 grains stands out like an absolute beacon in clear water in the edge. Never be tempted to get a few handfuls. As soon as you do that, you've made it look like a trap and a fishing situation, and a very wary fish will clock that straight away and avoid it. But a fish coming through, passing over half a dozen or 10 grains, it will stop and eat them, because why wouldn't it? Doesn't represent any danger at all. So something like that with a plastic corn hook bait, or maybe a tiny little yellow pop-up or something, really, really can be good. But again, you've got to put it where you've seen the fish. On top of that, so we've covered south facing areas, reed beds and snags. I mean, snag trees, if you've got a lot of snags around your lake, start checking them now. Start putting a few bits of sweet corn or visible bait that you can see on the bottom of the snag, and just keep watching it. You will find that the snags themselves, or certain snags themselves, will go through a transition phase over the next month or two. A lot of snags around the lake don't get used by the fish. They have a few key favourites for whatever reason. It may be that they're south facing, maybe they're in a quiet part of the lake. Whatever the reason is, the carp will single those out. Maybe ones they've used last year, or it could be a new one this year, it could be a newly fallen tree. But when they single those out, it will become very, very apparent to the observer which snags are being used. And it's very simply whichever snag is cleanest underneath. Start putting a few bits of corn in, something that you can see if it's getting eaten, and watch the leaf litter and the debris that's accumulated under the snag throughout the winter period. If the carp come into a snag and start using it, that will get dispersed very quickly. And you can, through process of elimination, you can eliminate the vast majority of snags on a lake. So never be phased, never think, oh, there's 150 trees in the lake, which one could they be under? Just keep going around and clocking them, and you'll find that they will have 3 or 4 favourites, maybe less than that, that they use regularly. And that's how you determine them, by what's on the bottom. If you've got loads of viz, if you haven't got the viz, then try putting a GoPro or camera down periodically and just checking the bottom of the snags, because believe me, the snag that you look in that is dusted off, that has the leaf litter and the twigs pushed out the way, and it's just like a clean table, they are absolute gold dust for locating carp as the year progresses, not just in the spring. And whilst you may not be able to fish for them in the snag, most snags are too dense anyway, it gives you a superb window, literally and metaphorically, into where the carp are at a given time and what swim you want to be in. Because, and I've had people go, well, in the past say to me, well, what's the point of knowing the fish are in a particular snag if you can't fish from there because it's too snaggy? Well, it's a quite a simplistic process of elimination. If the carp are using a particular snag, you want to be in the swim that is as near to that as possible, as close to where the fish are as possible. I always think about the whole exercise of location as an exercise in distance reduction. So by that I mean, when you get out of bed in the morning, let's say you're 20 miles from the carp that you want to catch. You drive to the lake and you take away 19.5 miles of that straight away, down to half a mile. Then you're going to walk around the lake, try and work out exactly what part of the lake they're in, and you get that half a mile down to a square 50 yards. Then you're going to get into the swim that is looking around that lake and watch where they're fizzing and the area within the swim, and you've got it down from 50 yards to 5 yards. Then you make that cast and you've got it from 5 yards down to 6 inches. It's a constant process of distance reduction, da-dun, 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 till you're there. That's how I think of it. Always try and push those goalposts together in terms of location until you've narrowed that bandwidth down to absolutely as close to zero as you can get it. That's your objective. That's what you're trying to do. So yeah, looking into snags and looking whether they've been used, not just snags, but different areas and spots along the margins will be cleaned in the same way. So anywhere that you see that's dusted off, any flanking spots, you know, if fish will want to clean themselves of leeches this time of year. I've seen a lot of leached up fish this year, and even on some perch that I caught recently, they had leeches on them, and fish will be looking to get rid of those, and that's when you see some of this frenetic carp activity. You see that a lot in the spring, splashing out up to their tail and coming down with huge force of re-entry, and a lot of that is to dislodge argillus or leeches that have become attached through the winter. It's almost, you can imagine the carp just feel itchy sometimes, you know, with all that stuff on their body, and they just, by vigorous re-entry, one of my favourite expressions, they can shake some of these parasites free. I think that's one of the reasons why they like reed beds so much, because the slightly abrasive surface of the reed stems, you know, the fish are coming through, and you can imagine that they'll use those to rub and clean themselves off on. And again, with this clattering out that you tend to see a lot in the spring, I think that's a big part of what they're doing. And in terms of feeding fish signs and location, some people go, well, is it a feeding fish, should I fish for it? My answer to that is, if you see the fish, that's where they are, fish for them. Don't preoccupy yourself too much with necessarily with what they're doing. That's telling you where you need to be. So visual opportunities is where carp fishing begins and ends for me. And visual opportunities for the last 3 or 4 months have been very, very thin on the ground. And now is when they're on the up. You're on an exponential rise now to the zenith of seeing carp show all day, all night, in just about anywhere, you know, because the water temperature is rising and the fish are going to become more and more active. So because visual opportunities are where it is all at, I get super excited and animated about this time of year, because now I can start to use the Polaroids, I can get up trees, I can look under bushes, and that whole phase of winter inactivity and a lot of the time, let's be honest, boredom, you know, a lot of the time just nothing really happens, and you're straining and yearning for a sign, and you go and check reed beds and you get up trees and you look in, and you really more in hope than expectation, you know. Most of the time you don't see anything, but now you'll start to see them. And when I finish this in a minute, I'm going to go off and I'm going to get up some trees and I'm going to be looking hard, because the game is very, very, very much afoot now. Wind direction is something that you should always bear in mind. Carp in the springtime do love a wind. I mean, carp on a lot of lakes at all times of year will react to wind. The interesting thing is that in the spring, even though it's often about body temperature, you can find them on the end of cold new winds in the spring. And I've wrestled with this a few times. There's been lots of times where I've gone round and I've stood on the end of a cold wind in the spring, and you're almost thinking, I hope I don't find them here. But quite occasionally you will do. quite occasionally, quite often, occasionally. But you will find that, and I think that generally the reason for that is that although it feels like a cold wind to you and you might have to put a fleece on, the water temperature might only be 7 degrees, and actually the air temperature is warmer than the water, even though it feels chilly. So it's not chilly in the water at all. And you will find that carp will sometimes collect on the end of new spring winds, even if they're cold. Also, they will be very regularly found on the back of the wind, and this is what I mean as there are no rules. Those flat, calm sun traps are also great places for finding fish. I would always speculate on a new wind and have a look and sit on the end of it, but I would say probably the majority of the time in the spring, 2/3 of the time, I found them on the back in the sun, in the lee of an island perhaps, where it's calm and the wind's not hitting it, just soaking up the sunshine. Again, as I keep iterating, you have to keep an open mind when it comes to location, because carp are wild animals. But these are guidelines that you can put into your fishing, and hopefully will give you an idea of maybe where you want to look first. Islands become very, very attractive to carp in the spring, again, particularly south-facing islands. I remember down at the quarry when I was on there, the south-facing edges of the main islands at this time of year were really good spots to get bites, fishing right up the shelf with singles, maybe a foot zig or something like that. Really, really good. So the carp will be moving into shallower zones. They will be, even if they're in open water, they will be up in the upper layers a lot, which means that you can see them. It means that they are susceptible to a zig, but I like it now because they're starting to come in close and you can catch them on the bottom in close with some careful angling. So there are a few thoughts on spring fishing. I think we've covered everything from location to mindset to tactics. Keep it lean, don't overdo it, and stay proactive. You know, from now on, this is the phase where if someone says to me, the carp don't show on my lake, mate, then I know they're not looking hard enough, because by the time you watch this, the fish will be easy to find on almost every lake, even low stock venues. You know, if you're prepared to put in the legwork and you've got quite clear water, then you should be able to find them. So it comes down again to how much you want it, how much effort you're willing to put in, but now is the time. It's the most magnificent time of the year to be on the bank. I remember back when we used to have the close season and we used to hang up the rods right now. It'd be like no fishing until the middle of June. So we're gifted with a bounteous and wonderful time to be out and about. Let's put all the misery of lockdowns and a winter behind us. Yes, the lakes are going to be busy, but get that in your mind before you go. Don't be defeated by that. You know, last year the lakes were so busy. I had one of my best years ever fishing a very busy lake. Get your head round that. Don't think, oh, I'll go today and hope it's going to be quiet. It probably won't be. Most lakes are busy, but there's a load of other like-minded great people out there that are willing to have a cup of tea with you. Sit back, relax, once you've found a carp, and enjoy being out. It's a wonderful time to experience the wonderful thing that is carp fishing.